I'm Jessica Wilson, 34, and last month I stood in a courtroom watching my estranged father demand every penny of my inheritance from my grandmother. 22 years of silence, then suddenly, he wanted what was rightfully his through parental rights. When his lawyer suggested I was being selfish, something inside me snapped. I asked the judge if I could speak directly to the court. What I revealed next made the entire room freeze. The judge turned pale. My father couldn't look me in the eye. This case wasn't about money. It was about something far more valuable that he had already stolen. Before I tell you how I brought a courtroom to complete silence, take a second to subscribe if you've ever had to stand up to someone who tried to take what was rightfully yours. Let me know where you're watching from. My childhood in Portland started simply enough. We lived in a modest 2-bedroom house with a small backyard where my mother planted daffodils every spring. Mom worked as a nurse at Providence Portland Medical Center, often taking night shifts so she could be home when I returned from school. My father Robert worked as a real estate agent, though looking back his successes were few and far between. He'd come home some days jubilant about a big sale, other days irritable and withdrawn. I didn't understand then how this pattern would come to define our lives. When I was 8, something shifted in our household. Dad started coming home later smelling of cigarettes, though he supposedly didn't smoke. Mom would send me to my room and their hushed arguments would seep through the walls. I'd press my ear against my bedroom door catching fragments "you promised last time" and "we can't afford this." What I didn't know then was that my father had developed a gambling addiction. It started innocently. Poker games with friends, small bets on sports. But as with many addictions, it escalated quickly. The card games moved to casinos. The sports bets grew larger. Dad chased losses with bigger bets, convinced the next hand would turn everything around. Mom protected me from these realities. When bill collectors called, she'd smile tightly and say it was work. When the electricity was shut off for a day, she called it an adventure as we ate dinner by candlelight. She worked extra shifts, her eyes carrying dark circles that no amount of concealer could hide. During these uncertain times, my grandmother Eleanor became my rock. Mom's mother lived across town in a neat little house with a garden that seemed magical to my young eyes. Weekend visits to Grandma Eleanor's became my sanctuary. She taught me to bake blueberry muffins and play chess. Most importantly, she taught me about money. "Jessica," she'd say, counting quarters into my palm from her change jar, "always save a little of what you earn, even if it's just pennies. It's not about being rich, it's about having choices." Those quarters went into a small ceramic piggy bank she gave me for my 10th birthday. Little did I know how significant those early lessons would become. When I was 12, everything fell apart. I came home from school one Thursday to find my mother sitting at our kitchen table, her face ashen. Dad was gone. So was their joint savings account. All $28,000 of it. Money that was supposed to be for emergencies, for my college fund, for our future. He'd emptied it the day before, and disappeared without a note. The following weeks were a blur of adult problems that no child should witness. Mom scrambling to keep our house working double shifts until she could barely stand. The shame in her eyes when she had to ask Grandma Eleanor for help with the mortgage. The way she'd still tuck me in at night assuring me everything would be okay, though her voice trembled. What amazed me most during this time was that Mom never spoke ill of my father. "People make mistakes, Jessica," she'd say. "Your dad is fighting his own battles." Her grace was extraordinary, though now I recognize it might have also been denial. Grandma Eleanor stepped in without hesitation. She helped financially but was careful not to undermine Mom's dignity. More importantly, she showed me what female strength looked like. While Mom worked, Grandma made sure I stayed on track in school, established routines, and created a sense of normalcy despite our new reality. Determined to help, I started babysitting neighborhood kids at 13. By 15, I was working weekends at the local grocery store, bagging groceries and collecting shopping carts. Every dollar I earned went toward household expenses, despite Mom's protests that I should save for myself. School became my focus, the one thing I could control. I excelled in math and science, discovering a knack for computer programming in a high school elective class. My teacher, Miss Brennan, recognized my aptitude and encouraged me to apply for scholarships. With her guidance and countless late nights working on applications, I secured a full scholarship to the University of Washington's computer science program. The day I received my acceptance letter was one of the happiest in our post-dad life. Mom took a rare day off and Grandma Eleanor brought over a homemade chocolate cake. For the first time in years, our kitchen felt light with possibility, rather than heavy with struggle. My college years were marked by determination. While classmates partied, I worked part-time at the university IT department and maintained a perfect GPA. Every break, I returned home to Portland working temp jobs to help Mom with bills. Despite my insistence, she refused to touch the small savings account I had started for her. Junior year disaster struck again. Mom called on a random Tuesday, her voice unnaturally calm. Stage 3 breast cancer. The words hit like physical blows. I wanted to quit school immediately, but Mom wouldn't hear of it. "This is what we've worked for," she insisted. "I'll be fine." But I knew better. I accelerated my course load, taking extra classes to graduate a semester early. By the time I returned home permanently, Mom's condition had deteriorated. The cancer was aggressive, advancing to stage 4 despite treatment. I spent the next 2 years as her caregiver, working remotely for a small tech company, while managing her medications appointments and eventually hospice care. Throughout it all, Mom maintained that same grace that had characterized her entire life. Not once did she complain about the unfairness of her situation. Not once did she curse my father for abandoning us. When she died, I was 24, holding her hand as she took her final breath. My father never called, never sent a card, never acknowledged her passing. Grandma Eleanor, then 85, became my only family. We grieved together, finding solace in shared memories of Mom's laugh, her kindness, her resilience. In my darkest moments of grief, I remembered Mom's favorite saying, "The only way out is through." And so I went through one day at a time. With Mom gone, I had to figure out what came next. Portland held too many memories, so I accepted a job offer in Seattle at a tech startup called Next Gen Solutions. The position paid barely enough to cover my modest apartment and student loans, but it offered something more valuable: opportunity. Next Gen developed business software solutions. Not the most glamorous corner of the tech world, but one with solid growth potential. I started as a junior developer, often the first to arrive and last to leave. While other new hires complained about menial tasks, I absorbed everything I could about our products, our clients, and our industry. My tiny apartment became little more than a place to sleep. Weekends disappeared into learning new programming languages and studying market trends. Grandma Eleanor worried about my work-life balance during our weekly phone calls. "Success means nothing if you're too exhausted to enjoy it," she cautioned. "I'm building something," I'd assure her. "This won't be forever." Within 3 years, my dedication paid off with a promotion to team lead. I managed 5 developers, all of them men, most older than me. The tech industry's gender imbalance wasn't just a statistic. It was my daily reality. In meetings, I had to work twice as hard to be heard half as much. Rather than becoming discouraged, I let it fuel my determination. My breakthrough came unexpectedly. After noticing inefficiencies in how our clients utilized our primary software product, I spent 6 months developing an integrated analytics module that could predict user needs and streamline workflows. I worked on it during evenings and weekends, showing no one until it was ready. When I finally demonstrated the prototype to our CEO, his usual poker face gave way to genuine excitement. Within weeks, my analytics module became Next Gen's competitive advantage, featured prominently in marketing materials and sales pitches. New clients signed on specifically because of my innovation. Throughout this career growth, Grandma Eleanor remained my anchor. Though she never fully understood what I did for a living, "You fix computers, right, dear," she understood ambition and perseverance. During my visits to Portland, she'd listen attentively as I explained company politics and industry challenges, offering wisdom that transcended the technological specific. "People are people, whether they're using slide rules or smartphones," she'd say, drawing from her own career as an administrative assistant in the 1,960 seconds. With my increased salary, I began investing conservatively. A mutual fund here, some blue chip stocks there. Grandma had taught me the value of making money work for me. I lived well below my means, driving the same used Honda I'd had since college, and sharing an apartment with a roommate despite being able to afford my own place. The real financial turning point arrived unexpectedly. When Next Gen was just hitting its stride, tech giant Meridian Systems announced its intention to acquire our company. As a team lead and creator of our most valuable product feature, I had been granted stock options early on, options I'd almost forgotten about amid the daily work grind. When the acquisition finalized, those options translated to $2.3 million. I sat in my cubicle staring at the confirmation email, unable to process the figure. My first call was to Grandma Eleanor. "Don't do anything rash," she advised, her voice steady despite her excitement. "Most sudden wealth disappears just as suddenly." I followed her advice, consulting with financial advisors and making careful investment decisions. Rather than splurging on luxuries or quitting work altogether, I stayed at Meridian for another 2 years, learning everything I could about operating at the corporate enterprise level. At 29, confident in my experience and financial security, I launched Wilson Consulting, specializing in analytics solutions for medium-sized businesses. Starting my own company terrified and exhilarated me in equal measure. The early months involved sleepless nights questioning every decision and the unique loneliness of leadership. But my reputation in the industry opened doors. Former colleagues recommended my services. Initial clients became enthusiastic references for new ones. By the end of the first year, I had to hire 3 employees to keep up with demand. By year 3, we had offices in Seattle and Portland with 20 employees and a client waiting list. Through it all, I maintained a low profile. No flashy car, no mansion, no extravagant lifestyle that might attract attention. I finally purchased my first property, a comfortable 2-bedroom condo with a view of Lake Union. The only luxury I allowed myself was quality furniture pieces chosen to last decades rather than follow trends. With financial stability came the space to consider other aspects of life. I established a scholarship fund for women in STEM at my alma mater. I mentored young women entering the tech field, remembering how isolating it had felt being the only woman in the room. Every Saturday morning, I volunteered teaching basic computer skills at a center for survivors of domestic violence. My personal life remained relatively quiet. Friends urged me to date, but relationships had never been my priority. A brief romance with Derek, another tech entrepreneur, ended amicably when our company's demands left little time for connection. We remained friends, occasionally meeting for coffee to discuss industry news. Over time, I built a chosen family of close friends. Mia, my college roommate, now working as an environmental lawyer. Jasmine, my first hire at Wilson Consulting. Thomas, a client who became a trusted advisor. And his husband Gabriel, who insisted on hosting monthly dinner parties for our little group. They filled the family-shaped hole in my life, celebrating victories and providing comfort during setbacks. Through all this success, my father remained completely absent. No congratulatory notes when my business was featured in Seattle Business Monthly. No birthday cards. No attempts at reconciliation. And honestly, I preferred it that way. The wound had scarred over years ago. I rarely thought of him, and when I did, it was with a distant clinical curiosity rather than pain. He had become a cautionary tale rather than a presence. Grandma Eleanor watched my success with quiet pride, never once saying "I told you so" about the financial lessons she'd instilled. Though advancing age limited her activities, her mind remained sharp. Our Sunday phone calls became sacred routine, and I flew to Portland monthly for weekend visits. During one such visit, as we sorted through old family photos, she paused over a picture of my mother as a young woman. "Margaret would be so proud of you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Not because of the money or the business, but because you've become exactly who you were meant to be despite everything." Those words meant more than any business achievement ever could. When Grandma Eleanor turned 90, I noticed subtle changes. Phone conversations that once lasted an hour shortened to 20 minutes. She occasionally repeated stories she'd told the previous week. Her handwriting and birthday cards grew shakier. During visits, I found expired food in her refrigerator and unpaid bills on her desk. Small oversights completely uncharacteristic of her meticulous nature. After careful discussion, we agreed she would move to Seattle. I found a lovely senior living community 10 minutes from my condo, independent living with healthcare options available as needed. The decision to sell her Portland home of 50 years wasn't easy, but she approached it with characteristic practicality. "It's just a house," she said as we packed her belongings. "The memories come with me." The next 2 years were precious. Sunday dinners became our tradition. I'd pick her up and we'd either cook together in my kitchen or try a new restaurant. She joined my friend group, seamlessly charming everyone with her sharp wit and surprising progressiveness. Jasmine particularly adored her, stopping by the senior community regularly to play cards and seek relationship advice. Grandma's mind remained nimble, even as her body weakened. She read voraciously, joined the center's investment club, quickly becoming its president, and kept up with current events more diligently than most people half her age. When I gifted her an iPad, she mastered it within days, soon texting me article links and FaceTiming without assistance. The decline, when it came, happened swiftly. A fall in her apartment led to a hospital stay that revealed underlying health issues. Tests showed advanced heart disease that had gone undetected. Treatment options existed but carried significant risks at her age. Quality over quantity, Jessica, she said, firmly from her hospital bed. I've had 92 wonderful years. I don't need to spend what's left in hospitals. Following her wishes, we arranged hospice care in her apartment. For 6 weeks, I split my time between running my company remotely and sitting beside her bed. We watched old movies, reminisced about Mom, and talked openly about death and legacy. I'm not afraid, she told me one evening as twilight painted her room in soft blues. I've lived exactly the life I wanted. That's a rare gift. She died peacefully in her sleep on a Tuesday morning in April. I was holding her hand, having spent the night in the recliner beside her bed. Her expression was serene, almost smiling. The world felt immediately emptier. The grief was different than when Mom died. Less raw, perhaps, but deeper in some ways. Grandma Eleanor had been my constant, my North Star, my last blood relation who truly knew me. With her gone, I stood alone as the last of my maternal family line. 2 weeks after the funeral, Grandma's attorney, Richard Baxter, called requesting a meeting. I'd expected to discuss her will, knowing she'd likely left me her modest savings and personal possessions. What I wasn't prepared for was the figure he presented. The total estate value is approximately $12.8 million, he stated matter-of-factly. I laughed, certain I'd misheard. You mean $1.28 million? Richard adjusted his glasses, sliding a financial statement across his desk. No, Jessica. 12.8 million. The pages revealed a financial life I'd never known existed. Strategic investments in real estate, pharmaceuticals, and technology, dating back to the 1972. Dividend-producing stocks held for decades. Municipal bonds. Even cryptocurrency purchased 5 years ago. My technology-resistant grandmother had somehow recognized that opportunity before most financial experts. She was quite remarkable, Richard noted, smiling at my shock. Eleanor started investing the small inheritance she received from her parents, making conservative but smart choices throughout her life. She accelerated her investments after your grandfather died, having complete control of their finances for the first time. Why didn't she tell me? I wondered aloud. She was concerned wealth might change your path. She wanted you to build your own success, which you have. She was immensely proud of that. The inheritance came with a letter written in Grandma's distinctive handwriting. She explained her secrecy, expressing confidence in my ability to use the money wisely. Her only request that I consider establishing a foundation in my mother's name. Margaret never got to fulfill her potential, she wrote. Help others fulfill theirs. In the weeks that followed, I processed this new reality while grieving. I decided to create the Margaret Wilson Memorial Scholarship for nursing students from disadvantaged backgrounds, a fitting tribute to Mom's compassionate nature and unfulfilled dreams. 6 weeks after Grandma's death, as I was beginning to adjust to my new normal, a letter arrived with a Portland postmark. The handwriting was unfamiliar, the return address from a part of town I didn't recognize. Inside was a single page of lined paper. Dear Jessica, I hope this letter finds you well. I recently learned of Eleanor's passing and wanted to extend my condolences. It's been far too long since we've spoken, a reality I deeply regret. I've thought about reaching out many times over the years, but never found the right words. I'd very much like to reconnect and discuss some family matters in person. I'll be in Seattle next week and could meet at your convenience. Your father, Robert Wilson. The paper trembled in my hands. 22 years of silence, and now this vague, presumptuous note. No acknowledgement of his abandonment, no mention of Mom's death. Just condolences and mysterious family matters. I nearly tore it up, but curiosity prevailed. After days of internal debate, I texted the phone number he'd included, suggesting coffee at a public place near my office. Seeing him after 2 decades was surreal. At 60, Robert Wilson's once dark hair had grayed completely. Deep lines surrounded his eyes and mouth. He'd gained weight around his middle, lost some at his hairline. But his eyes, those were unchanged. The same hazel shade as mine, the same tendency to crinkle at the corners when he smiled uncertainly. Jessica, he said, rising as I approached the table. He moved as if to hug me, then seemed to think better of it, extending his hand instead. Thank you for meeting me. The conversation started superficially. Yes, I was well. Yes, I lived in Seattle permanently now. Yes, I worked in technology. No, I wasn't married. He shared that he had returned to Portland 5 years ago after trying his luck in various cities. He was working in sales for a commercial cleaning equipment company. He mentioned being married and divorced several times, no children from those relationships. I volunteered minimal information, watching him carefully. There was nervousness in how he stirred his coffee continuously, how his eyes darted around the cafe. He was building to something. Eleanor was always such a strong woman, he eventually said, segueing awkwardly. I'm sorry for your loss. I know you two were close. We were, I replied simply. Your mother too, she was. She was special. My jaw tightened. You weren't at her funeral. He flinched. I didn't know until months later. I should have been there. Yes, you should have. A uncomfortable silence followed before he cleared his throat. I understand Eleanor was quite comfortable in her later years. And there it was. The true purpose of this reunion. What exactly do you mean? I asked, my tone cooling considerably. Well, she was always good with money. Frugal, I imagine she left things in good order. She did. His fingers drummed on the table. I suppose. Well, as her former son-in-law, I wondered if she might have remembered me in some way. We were family once. The audacity was breathtaking. I studied him, this stranger, with my eyes and jawline, who had materialized after 2 decades of absence to ask about inheritance money. Grandma left her estate to me, I said flatly. All of it. His expression flickered. Disappointment poorly disguised as acceptance. I see. Well, that's her right, of course. Though family obligations are important considerations in these matters. Family obligations, I repeated incredulously. Like the obligation to not abandon your wife and child, that kind of family obligation. Now, Jessica, he said, his tone conciliatory but eyes calculating, I know you harbor resentment. That's natural, but I was dealing with significant personal demons back then. The gambling was a disease you never sought treatment for, apparently. That's not fair. I've made mistakes. Mistakes. My voice rose despite my efforts to remain composed. Is that what you call emptying our bank accounts and disappearing for 22 years? A mistake. Other cafe patron glanced our way. I took a deep breath, gathering myself. How much did she leave you? He asked, dropping all pretense. I stood collecting my purse. This meeting is over. Jessica, wait, don't contact me again. For 2 weeks that seemed to be the end of it. Then the text started. First apologetic, then increasingly entitled. He mentioned exploring options and legal avenues regarding family estates. I blocked his number. 3 days later, a formal letter arrived from Layton and Associates attorneys at law. My father was suing me for my entire inheritance, claiming parental rights to assets that should have been family property. The court summons that followed felt like a physical assault. Standing in my kitchen, reading the legal language that twisted reality into unrecognizable shapes, I experienced a moment of perfect clarity. This was no longer about money. This was about standing up to the person who had shaped my life through his absence. I called the most aggressive attorney I knew. Stephanie Carson's office occupied the 27th floor of a downtown Seattle high-rise with views of Elliott Bay. Her reputation preceded her. Brilliant, ruthless, and selective about her cases. When her assistant led me into a conference room, I found a woman who defied the stereotypical lawyer image. In her early 50s, with silver-streaked black hair cut in a sharp bob, she wore a vintage band t-shirt under her tailored blazer. Multiple earrings lined her left ear. Her handshake was firm, her assessment direct. So your deadbeat dad wants your grandmother's money, she summarized after I explained the situation. On what grounds exactly? I passed her the court documents. She scanned them, occasional scoffs punctuating her reading. This is garbage, she declared, tossing the papers aside. His attorney is making ridiculous claims about family inheritance rights that don't exist under Washington law. Eleanor was free to leave her assets to whomever she chose. So we can get this dismissed. Absolutely. But Stephanie leaned forward, elbows on the table. I suggest we don't. Not immediately. She explained that while the case had little legal merit, a simple dismissal wouldn't necessarily end my father's attempts. Men like your father don't give up easily when there's money involved, she said. I recommend we use discovery to understand exactly what we're dealing with. Discovery, she explained, would force my father to reveal his financial situation, background, and motives under oath. This information would strengthen our position if he attempted further legal action. It will cost more, she warned, but it may save you future headaches. I agreed to her strategy, signing the retainer agreement before leaving her office. Over the next weeks, Stephanie's team launched a comprehensive investigation into Robert Wilson's life since he'd abandoned us. What they uncovered was illuminating. 5 failed marriages, the most recent ending just 6 months earlier. A string of jobs lasting no more than 2 years each. Evictions, tax liens, and most significantly gambling debts totaling approximately $340,000 to entities that operated in legal gray areas. Your father is desperate, Stephanie explained during our next meeting. These aren't casino debts. These are loans from people who don't typically use the court system to collect. The picture became clearer. My father wasn't seeking reconciliation or even what he might convince himself was rightfully his. He needed a bailout, and I was his last option. Discovery also revealed this wasn't his first attempt at financial opportunism. He'd sued a former employer for wrongful termination, settled for a modest sum, filed dubious insurance claims, and even challenged the prenuptial agreement in his fourth divorce. Meanwhile, my father's attorney Lawrence Layton launched a PR offensive. He gave statements to local business publications about abandoned children seeking rightful family assets and opportunities for reconciliation. The story gained traction, particularly after a journalist discovered my role at Wilson Consulting. Tech executive sued by estranged father in inheritance battle, read one headline. My privacy, carefully maintained throughout my career, evaporated overnight. Photographers appeared outside my office. Industry acquaintances sent awkward messages of support. Clients called wanting reassurance that the litigation wouldn't affect our services. The stress manifested physically. Insomnia, tension, headaches, a perpetual knot in my stomach. During our Sunday friend dinners, I found myself checking my phone constantly, unable to fully engage in conversations. You need to compartmentalize, advised Thomas, who had experienced his own family legal battles. Set specific times to think about the case. The rest of the time, it's off limits in your mind. Easier said than done, but I tried. Work provided some escape. I delegated more responsibilities to my leadership team but kept myself busy enough to limit rumination. 2 weeks before our court date, my doorbell rang unexpectedly on a Saturday morning. Through the peephole, I spotted Derek, my ex-boyfriend, holding a paper bag. "Peace offering," he said when I opened the door, extending the bag that contained pastries from our favorite bakery. "Jasmine told me about the lawsuit. Thought you might need reinforcements." Despite ending our relationship 3 years earlier, Derek had always been a supportive presence in my life. That morning he listened as I vented my frustration, then helped me organize the case documents scattered across my dining table. His background in business law provided useful insights. "Your father's case is legally weak," he confirmed, echoing Stephanie. "But courts can be unpredictable when family is involved. Judges are human. They bring their own biases to family disputes." That evening, after Derek left, I found myself opening a box I'd kept in my closet since Mom's death. It contained her personal effects, photographs, jewelry, and several journals I'd never had the heart to read. Something about the looming court case pushed me to finally open the worn leather covers. My mother's handwriting filled page after page. Early entries documented happy moments, my school achievements, holiday celebrations, everyday joys. Then came the darker period. She chronicled my father's gambling in painstaking detail, the lies, the stolen money, the broken promises. She described finding ATM receipts, credit card statements hidden in his car loan documents with exorbitant interest rates. One entry from shortly before he left particularly stood out. "Confronted Robert about the second mortgage today. He denied everything until I showed him the paperwork. Then he broke down, promised to get help. I want to believe him, but this is the fourth last time. How much more can we lose before there's nothing left? I have to protect Jessica." I stayed up all night reading, tears streaming as I witnessed my mother's struggle through her own words. By morning, my sadness had transformed into something harder, more resolute. My father hadn't just stolen money, he'd stolen years of security and peace from my mother. Now he wanted to take Grandma Eleanor's legacy too. No, not this time. The morning of court, I dressed in a navy suit, professional, but not flashy. Stephanie had advised against anything that might suggest extravagant wealth. My hair pulled back in a simple chignon, minimal jewelry, subtle makeup. The image in my mirror looked composed, but inside my heart raced. "Remember," Stephanie said as we met outside the courthouse, "let me do the talking unless directed to speak by the judge. Don't react visibly to anything your father or his attorney says, no matter how provocative." I nodded, taking deep breaths as we walked through security and toward courtroom 3C. King County Courthouse stood as a stately contrast to the modern buildings surrounding it. Inside, the polished marble floors and wood-paneled walls conveyed a gravitas that seemed appropriate for the proceedings about to unfold. Courtroom 3C was smaller than I'd imagined, intimate almost, with 3 rows of spectator benches, most empty at this early hour. I sat beside Stephanie at the defendant's table, arranging my notepads and water bottle with methodical precision, small actions to occupy my shaking hands. The plaintiff's table remained empty, the clock showing 10 minutes before our scheduled hearing. At precisely 8:55, the courtroom doors swung open. My father entered, flanked by Lawrence Layton, a silver-haired man with an expensive suit and practiced smile. Dad had dressed for the occasion in what appeared to be new clothes: crisp blue shirt, conservative tie, dark slacks. His hair was freshly cut, face cleanly shaved. The consummate respectable father. Our eyes met briefly before I looked away, focusing instead on organizing the already neat stack of documents before me. From my peripheral vision, I noticed a court reporter setting up, followed by a bailiff who took position near the judge's bench. "All rise," the bailiff announced minutes later. The Honorable Judge Catherine Montgomery presiding. Judge Montgomery entered briskly, a black woman in her 60s with close-cropped gray hair and rectangular glasses. Her reputation preceded her, fair but stern, with little patience for frivolous claims or courtroom theatrics. She settled into her seat, reviewing the docket before addressing the room. "Wilson versus Wilson," she stated. "Inheritance dispute." Her gaze moved between the two tables. "Let's begin with opening statements. Mr. Layton." Lawrence Layton approached the podium with the confidence of a man accustomed to commanding attention. His opening painted a masterpiece of manipulation. My father characterized as a flawed but fundamentally decent man who had made regrettable mistakes in his younger years. He spoke of addiction as a disease of my father's supposed multiple attempts to reconnect, that I had rebuffed of the natural rights of a parent to family asset. "Your Honor, Robert Wilson doesn't seek this inheritance out of greed," Layton concluded, his voice resonating with practiced sincerity. "He seeks what any parent would: the opportunity to repair a family fractured by unfortunate circumstances. Miss Wilson's vindictive withholding of these family assets represents not justice, but punishment for decades-old mistakes my client has spent years attempting to rectify." Throughout his speech, I maintained a neutral expression despite the internal scream building in my chest. The sheer audacity of rewriting history so completely was breathtaking. Stephanie approached the podium next, her demeanor calm but intense. "Your Honor, this case isn't about family reconciliation. It's about money. Specifically money Mr. Wilson has no legal or moral claim to. The facts are straightforward. Eleanor Wilson legally bequeathed her estate to her granddaughter Jessica Wilson. The plaintiff, who abandoned his family 22 years ago, taking their savings and disappearing completely, now resurfaces within weeks of learning about this inheritance. She methodically dismantled Layton's claims, presenting bank records showing my father's withdrawal of our family savings, documentation of his complete absence during my mother's illness and death, and affidavits from my mother's former colleagues attesting to her struggles as a suddenly single parent. The plaintiff had no contact with Eleanor Wilson for over 2 decades. He made no attempt to assist during his ex-wife's terminal illness. He contributed nothing to his daughter's upbringing or education. In fact, Your Honor, his only documented interaction with my client prior to this lawsuit was a coffee meeting where he explicitly inquired about the value of her inheritance. Judge Montgomery listened attentively, occasionally making notes. When both attorneys finished, she adjusted her glasses. "I'd like to hear directly from the principals," she stated. "Mr. Wilson, you'll testify first." My father took the stand, sworn in with his right hand raised. Under Layton's careful questioning, he spun a narrative of redemption. A man who had fallen prey to addiction but had fought his way back to decency. He claimed to have attempted contact multiple times over the years, sending cards and letters that apparently never reached me. He spoke of his profound regret over missing my mother's final years and my adolescence. "I just want what any father wants," he said, voice cracking on cue. "A chance to make things right with my daughter. This isn't about money, it's about healing. Eleanor would have wanted our family whole again." I dug my fingernails into my palm beneath the table, the physical pain a distraction from the mounting rage. Stephanie's cross-examination was surgical. "Mr. Wilson, you testified that you sent cards and letters to your daughter. Do you have any proof of these communications?" "Well, no, I didn't keep receipts. Not even one returned letter. No email confirmations. No phone records of attempted calls. It was a difficult time." "Yes or no, Mr. Wilson? Do you have any evidence whatsoever of these alleged attempts at contact?" "No." "You stated that you've overcome your gambling addiction. Are you currently in treatment for this condition?" A pause. "Not formally, no." "Have you ever been in formal treatment?" "I attended some meetings years ago." "Some meetings. How many exactly? 3 or 4. I see. And do you currently have any gambling debts? My father shifted uncomfortably. Some outstanding matters, yes. Would those outstanding matters include $340,000 owed to various lenders, some with connections to organized crime? Layton objected immediately. Judge Montgomery overruled after Stephanie presented financial documentation obtained during discovery. Yes, my father admitted quietly. By the time Stephanie finished the sympathetic figure my father had presented, lay in ruins replaced by the reality, a desperate man with significant debts seeking an easy solution through a dubious legal claim. Then it was my turn. I approached the witness stand, swore my oath and sat facing the courtroom. From this vantage point, I could see my father clearly, his jaw-tight eyes now avoiding mine. Stephanie led me through my testimony methodically. I described my childhood before and after my father's departure, my mother's struggle as a single parent, my grandmother's support, and my own path to financial stability. I spoke of caring for my mother during her illness and final years of my close relationship with my grandmother until her death. Miss Wilson, Stephanie asked prior to receiving the letter mentioned in your testimony, when was the last time you had any contact with your father? The day before he disappeared with our family savings. I was 12 years old. And did he contact you when your mother was diagnosed with cancer? No. Did he attend her funeral? No. Did he contribute in any way to your college education or living expenses after leaving? No. And what was your reaction when you received his letter after your grandmother's death? I was surprised and suspicious of the timing. Layton's cross-examination aimed to portray me as cold, unforgiving, and materialistic. His questions grew increasingly aggressive. Miss Wilson, isn't it true that you've achieved significant financial success on your own? Yes, through hard work. So you don't need your grandmother's money, do you? That's irrelevant to her wishes regarding her estate. Isn't refusing to share any portion of this substantial inheritance with your only living parent rather selfish? The question hung in the air. Something inside me, a dam holding back 22 years of pain, cracked. Your Honor, I said, turning to Judge Montgomery. May I address the court directly? She studied me for a moment, then nodded. You may. I rose from the witness stand, stepping forward to face both the judge and my father directly. For the first time since entering the courtroom, I allowed myself to really look at him, this stranger who had shaped my life through his absence. Our identical hazel eyes met, and I held his gaze steadily. I've listened to my father claim he wants reconciliation, that this case is about healing our family. I've heard him express regret for mistakes, as if abandoning your family is equivalent to forgetting an anniversary. My voice remained controlled, each word deliberate. What the court doesn't know, what I only discovered myself days ago, is that my mother's cancer was initially detected 2 years before her official diagnosis. A small gasp escaped from someone in the gallery. My father's expression froze. I found her medical records while preparing for this case. She had concerning symptoms and went for preliminary tests while I was still in high school. Those tests showed abnormalities that warranted immediate follow-up, but she couldn't afford the specialist consultations or additional testing. Our health insurance had lapsed after my father emptied our accounts. I removed a folder from the evidence table, opening it to reveal medical documents. By the time she secured state assistance and received proper medical care 2 years later, her breast cancer had advanced to stage 4. According to her oncologist's notes, had she received treatment when the abnormalities were first detected, her prognosis would have been significantly better, a 87% survival rate versus 26%. The courtroom had fallen completely silent. Judge Montgomery's complexion had noticeably paled. My father stared at the table before him. My father isn't just asking for my grandmother's money. He's asking to profit from actions that likely cost my mother years of her life. I produced my mother's journals, placing them beside the medical records. These are my mother's personal journals. They document her knowledge of those initial test results, her desperate attempts to find affordable healthcare, and her decision to prioritize my education and well-being over her own medical needs. My voice wavered slightly before steadying again. She never told me any of this. She protected me from this truth, just as she protected me from the full reality of my father's abandonment. I returned to the evidence table, retrieving another document. This is a report from a licensed private investigator documenting my father's current gambling activities. Despite his testimony today, he visited Four Winds Casino 17 times in the past month alone. His current debts aren't just to banks or credit cards. They're to individuals known to use extreme measures for collection. Judge Montgomery reviewed the documents, her expression grave. My father's attorney attempted to object, but the judge silenced him with a raised hand. My father abandoned us, stole our savings, and vanished completely. He didn't call when my mother was dying. He didn't appear when she passed away. He expressed no interest in my existence until he learned about my grandmother's money. Now he wants the court to reward this behavior by giving him access to funds my grandmother explicitly left to me. I returned to my seat, legs shaking beneath my skirt but voice remaining steady. That's all I wish to say, Your Honor. This court will take a 1-hour recess, Judge Montgomery announced, rising abruptly. We'll reconvene at 1130. As the judge exited, the silence in the courtroom broke into hushed murmurs. My father remained seated, still staring downward, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. His attorney leaned over, speaking urgently into his ear. Stephanie squeezed my arm gently. Are you okay? I nodded, though, in truth, I felt hollow, emptied of the emotions I'd carried for so long. The truth was finally spoken, hanging in the air for all to witness, including the man who had spent decades avoiding it. As we waited for Judge Montgomery to return, the courtroom hummed with whispered conversations. Reporters who had initially come for a simple inheritance dispute now recognized they had stumbled upon something far more significant. Several attempted to approach me during the recess, but Stephanie efficiently ran interference, guiding me to a private conference room where I could collect myself. That was unexpected, she said once the door closed behind us. Why didn't you tell me about your mother's medical records? I only found them 3 nights ago, I explained, accepting the water bottle she offered. I wasn't even looking for them. I was reading Mom's journals for the first time, trying to understand everything. She mentioned a file box in her bedroom closet. I retrieved it from storage yesterday. Stephanie's expression was a mix of admiration and concern. It changes the entire complexion of the case, but introducing evidence last minute like that is risky. Leighton could move to have it stricken. Will Judge Montgomery allow that? Ordinarily, possibly, but given the nature of the evidence, and your father's demonstrably false testimony about his gambling, I think she'll allow it. Stephanie checked her watch. We should head back. Ready? I nodded, though ready hardly described my emotional state. The adrenaline that had carried me through my testimony was fading, leaving a strange, detached clarity in its wake. Re-entering the courtroom felt like stepping onto a stage. All eyes followed my movement to the defendant's table. My father had returned, but sat with slumped shoulders, his earlier performance of dignified paternal concern completely abandoned. Leighton whispered frantically in his ear, but my father seemed barely responsive. At precisely 1130, Judge Montgomery returned. The transformation in her demeanor was striking. The professional neutrality had given way to something harder, her gaze particularly sharp when it fell on my father. Having reviewed the evidence presented during testimony, I'm prepared to rule on this matter, she announced, foregoing the expected additional arguments from counsel. Before I do, Mr. Leighton, does your client wish to respond to Miss Wilson's testimony? Leighton stood quickly. Your Honor, we request time to review and authenticate the medical documents presented. My client had no knowledge. That wasn't my question, counsel. Judge Montgomery interrupted. Does your client wish to respond to his daughter's testimony? A simple yes or no will suffice. Leighton conferred briefly with my father, who shook his head slightly. No, Your Honor, Leighton replied. Very well. Judge Montgomery removed her glasses, placing them deliberately on the bench before her. In my 17 years presiding in this courtroom, I have encountered many family disputes. I have seen legitimate grievances and frivolous claims. What I have witnessed today falls into neither category. She directed her full attention to my father, who seemed to physically shrink under her gaze. Mr. Wilson, you have presented this court with what can only be described as a morally reprehensible lawsuit. You abandoned your family, absconded with their financial resources, and remained completely absent during your ex-wife's illness and death. You made no attempt to contact your daughter until learning of a substantial inheritance, then fabricated a narrative of attempted reconciliation that evidence clearly contradicts. Her words fell like hammer blows in the silent courtroom. The documentation Miss Wilson presented regarding her mother's medical situation is particularly disturbing. While the court cannot definitively establish that your actions directly caused the delay in treatment, the correlation is compelling and troubling. Judge Montgomery replaced her glasses, returning to her formal judicial demeanor. This case is dismissed with prejudice. Additionally, Mr. Wilson will be responsible for all legal fees incurred by the defendant. She paused, then added, I am also referring the evidence presented today to the District Attorney's Office for review of potential fraud charges related to Mr. Wilson's testimony under oath. With a final strike of her gavel, she concluded, Court is adjourned. The finality of her words hung in the air as she exited. Around us, the courtroom erupted in movement. Reporters hurrying out to file stories, the court reporter gathering materials, the bailiff approaching to explain post-hearing procedures. Through it all, I remained seated, a strange sense of peace washing over me. The truth had finally been spoken aloud, acknowledged by an objective authority. The validation wasn't necessary for my own healing, but it provided a symmetry, a closing of a circle that had remained open for too long. As Stephanie handled the administrative details, I gathered my belongings. My father rose from his table, his attorney unsuccessfully attempting to guide him toward the side exit. Instead, he moved in my direction, his expression unreadable. Jessica, he said as he approached, voice low and urgent. We need to talk. This isn't over. I looked at him directly, seeing not the monster of my childhood memories, nor the pathetic figure from the witness stand, but simply a flawed, desperate man whose choices had led him to this moment. It is over, I replied evenly. It was over 22 years ago when you walked out. Today just made it official. You don't understand. These people I owe money to, they're dangerous. I don't care what you need, I interrupted, surprising myself with the calmness in my voice. Your problems aren't mine anymore. They never should have been. Leighton appeared at his side, practically pulling him away. Robert, not here. There are reporters everywhere. My father allowed himself to be led toward the door but looked back once. I'll call you, he said, the words sounding more like a threat than a promise. I won't answer, I responded, turning away. Outside, the courthouse camera flashes greeted our emergence. Stephanie expertly guided me through the crowd with a firm, no comment at this time to each shouted question. Her car waited at the curb, the driver opening the door as we approached. Once inside the vehicle's quiet sanctuary, I finally exhaled fully for what felt like the first time in months. The tension that had been my constant companion began to dissipate, leaving exhaustion in its wake. What happens now, I asked as Seattle's streets slipped past the windows. Now, you go home, rest, and start putting this behind you, Stephanie replied. The legal battle is over. The emotional one might take a little longer. That evening, my phone rang with an unrecognized number. Against my better judgment, I answered. Jessica, my father's voice sounded different, hoarse, desperate. Please don't hang up. I need to explain. There's nothing to explain, I said, surprised by my own composure. You don't understand what I've been through. No, I don't. Just like you don't understand what Mom went through. What I went through. That's the point, Dad. We're strangers to each other, and that's by your choice. I made mistakes, he insisted. Terrible ones. But I'm still your father. The word struck me as so fundamentally empty coming from him. A father is more than biology. It's presence, support, guidance. You provided none of those things. I can change. I want to make amends. No, I interrupted firmly. What you want is money to pay your gambling debts. What you want is to escape the consequences of your choices, just like you've always done. But I'm not your escape route. Jessica, I don't hate you, I said, surprising myself with the truth of it. I just don't have a father. Goodbye. I ended the call and immediately blocked the number. Then I turned off my phone, completely set it aside, and for the first time since receiving that initial letter, I cried without restraint, not from sadness or anger but from release. Years of carefully contained emotions flowed freely until eventually exhaustion claimed me. I slept deeply that night, dreamless and uninterrupted, my body and mind, finally acknowledging that a burden had been set down never to be picked up again. The morning news reported that Robert Wilson had left Seattle overnight, his hotel room vacated without checkout. Later reports would confirm he'd crossed into Canada, presumably to avoid the potential fraud investigation. I felt nothing at this news, neither satisfaction nor concern. His choices were at last completely separate from my life. A week after the hearing, I received an unexpected letter. The return address showed a town in Idaho, the name unfamiliar, Catherine Wilson. The handwriting inside was delicate, elderly. Dear Jessica, it began. You don't know me, but I was briefly your father's wife, his fourth to be precise. I've followed your court case in the news, and I wanted to thank you for having the courage to stand up to Robert in a way I never could. Your testimony about your mother's medical situation gave me chills, as I recognized the same pattern of financial abuse that I experienced. Please know that by protecting yourself you've potentially protected others from his manipulation. I wish you peace and healing. Catherine. I sat with the letter for a long time contemplating the ripple effects of both harm and healing. My confrontation with my father hadn't just been about protecting my inheritance or even honoring my grandmother's wishes. It had been about breaking a cycle, speaking a truth that needed to be heard not just for my sake but potentially for others who might fall into my father's orbit. That realization lifted something I hadn't known was still weighing on me. A lingering doubt about the public nature of our confrontation. In exposing my father's actions, I hadn't just served my own healing, I'd potentially prevented further harm. The knowledge settled in me, solidifying the peace I'd begun to find. In the days following the court hearing, my phone buzzed constantly with notifications. News outlets requested interviews. Industry colleagues sent messages of support, or occasionally morbid curiosity, poorly disguised as concern. Social media exploded with opinions from strangers who knew nothing of the real story beyond sensationalized headlines. I declined all interview requests, issued a brief statement through Stephanie asking for privacy, and took a previously scheduled vacation week, extending it to 2. The time away from work and media scrutiny proved essential for processing the whirlwind events. I rented a small cabin on Orcas Island, bringing only books, comfortable clothes, and my mother's journals. Each morning, I woke with the sunrise, walked the forested trails, until physically tired, then returned to read more of my mother's words. The entries after my father left revealed a woman of extraordinary strength and vulnerability, oscillating between determination to provide stability for me and private moments of fear and exhaustion. Jessica asked about college funds today, one entry read. I smiled and told her not to worry, that we'd figure it out, then cried in the shower where she couldn't hear. Robert took everything, but I'll be damned if I'll let him take her future too. Another from when I was 16, parent-teacher conference today. Ms. Harmon says Jessica has real potential in computer science. She's so much smarter than I ever was. I see Margaret in her sometimes, the way she tackles problems head on. Mom says she'll help with community college if we need it. I'm too proud to ask, but for Jessica I'll swallow that pride if necessary. The revelations about her cancer came in entries from my senior year of high school. Initial symptoms dismissed as stress. The free clinic doctor suggesting more tests. The devastating insurance denial. Her calculations of costs versus income concluding that immediate treatment was financially impossible without sacrificing my education. Made decision today, she wrote in shaky handwriting. We'll use savings for Jessica's first year at UW instead of tests. Dr. Lipman says symptoms might be nothing. Can reassess after Jessica's settled at school. She must never know about this choice. She'd drop everything to help me, and I won't let Robert destroy her future too. By the end of my 2 weeks on the island, I had cried more than I thought humanly possible, but the tears were cleansing rather than debilitating. I returned to Seattle with a newfound clarity and sense of purpose. My first day back at the office, I called a company-wide meeting. Rumors and speculation had run rampant during my absence, and I owed my team transparency. Without delving into painful personal details, I explained the basics: my estranged father's lawsuit, its dismissal, and my commitment to refocusing completely on our work moving forward. The support was immediate and genuine, particularly from those who had been with me since the company's early days. That evening, Stephanie called with updates. The legal fees had been assessed against my father, though she was skeptical about ever collecting them. More significantly, the district attorney had opened an investigation into potential perjury charges based on my father's court testimony. They probably won't pursue it aggressively given he's fled the jurisdiction, she explained, but it establishes a record if he ever attempts something similar in the future. Do you think he will? I asked. Honestly, no. Judge Montgomery's ruling was devastating, and the publicity even more so. Your father strikes me as someone who avoids difficult confrontations rather than facing them. I suspect he'll stay far away from Seattle and legal proceedings for the foreseeable future. Her assessment proved accurate. In the months that followed, I received no further contact from my father. News reports eventually confirmed he had established residence in a small town in Alberta, Canada. The gambling debts remained unresolved, though I occasionally wondered about the dangerous people he'd mentioned. Had they followed him? Had he found another mark to exploit? These questions arose less frequently as time passed, eventually becoming footnotes in a chapter of life I considered closed. 6 months after the trial, as summer transitioned to fall, Derek invited me to dinner. We had maintained casual contact since the court case, occasionally meeting for coffee or industry events. This invitation felt different. A specific restaurant, a request that I dress up a bit. The evening proved lovely, our conversation flowing easily between professional updates and personal reflections. As dessert arrived, Derek reached across the table, taking my hand. "I've been wanting to ask," he began, uncharacteristically hesitant, "if you might consider giving us another chance. The timing was wrong before, with both our companies demanding everything we had. But things are different now, and I've never stopped thinking about what might have been." The question surprised me, though perhaps it shouldn't have. The attraction and compatibility had always been there. Circumstances rather than incompatibility had driven our separation. "I'd like that," I answered, surprising myself with the certainty I felt. "But slowly. I'm still figuring out who I am after everything that's happened." He agreed, and we began a deliberate, thoughtful reconstruction of our relationship. Unlike our previous whirlwind romance conducted between business meetings and late-night work sessions, this incarnation involved actual dates, long conversations, and the gradual intertwining of our separate lives. Meanwhile, work continued to provide purpose and satisfaction. Wilson Consulting expanded into new markets, and I found myself increasingly drawn to mentorship roles, particularly with young women entering the tech field. Their determination and fresh perspectives reminded me of my own early career before success and security had perhaps dulled some of that initial hunger. One evening in early November, as Seattle's persistent rain tapped against my living room windows, I revisited the idea that had first occurred to me during those quiet days on Orcas Island. My grandmother's inheritance remained largely untouched, aside from personal expenses and some strategic reinvestments. Her request that I establish something in my mother's name had stayed with me, gradually crystallizing into a clear vision. The next morning, I contacted an educational foundation specialist and began the process of establishing the Margaret Wilson Memorial Scholarship for single parents pursuing nursing education. The irony wasn't lost on me. My mother had sacrificed her health partly to ensure my education, and now her legacy would help others avoid similar impossible choices. The foundation took shape quickly, with an endowment structure ensuring its permanence. I worked closely with Seattle Central College's nursing department to establish selection criteria, emphasizing need, academic potential, and dedication to community health, all qualities my mother had embodied. As news of the scholarship spread within healthcare education circles, I received an unexpected call from Providence Portland Medical Center, where my mother had worked. They proposed naming their newly renovated staff lounge in her honor, remembering her dedication and mentorship of younger nurses. The gesture brought me to tears, confirmation that her impact had extended far beyond our small family unit. At the dedication ceremony in Portland, several of her former colleagues shared stories. I'd never heard how she had covered shifts for a coworker undergoing divorce, organized meal deliveries for another battling cancer, created an unofficial mentoring program for nursing assistants working toward their RN degrees. The woman they described matched the mother I'd known, but revealed dimensions I hadn't been privy to as her child. "Margaret never complained," said Susan, her former supervisor, now in her 70s. "Not about her workload, not about being a single parent, not even about her illness when it finally couldn't be hidden anymore. But she fought fiercely for her patients and for her daughter's future. That kind of quiet strength deserves to be remembered." Standing in that room surrounded by people who had known and valued my mother, I felt a shifting in how I carried her memory, less as a personal loss and more as a legacy of resilience and compassion that extended beyond me. It was, I realized, a healthier way to honor her. As the scholarship foundation took shape and my relationship with Derek deepened, I finally felt ready to establish more permanent roots. The condo I'd purchased years earlier had served its purpose but never quite felt like home. With Derek's encouragement, I began searching for a house, somewhere with enough space for both current comfort and future possibilities. The property I eventually purchased sat on a hillside overlooking Lake Washington, its large windows capturing both water views and the surrounding forest. The previous owners had established extensive gardens, including a secluded corner with a stone bench beside a small pond. The moment I saw it, I knew this would become my mother and grandmother's memorial garden. "This is it," I told the realtor, ending weeks of searching. "This feels right." Moving day coincided with the first anniversary of the court case. As the last boxes were delivered and the movers departed, leaving Derek and me amid organized chaos, he produced a bottle of champagne and 2 glasses. "A toast," he said, filling the glasses and handing me one. To new beginnings, hard-won wisdom, and the women who helped shape you into the person I love. We stood on the deck overlooking the garden and the lake beyond, glasses raised to the setting sun. In that moment, I felt a profound sense of having come full circle, still carrying the influences of my past but no longer defined or limited by them. To Mom and Grandma Eleanor, I added, and to the woman they helped me become. As twilight settled over the water, I silently added a third dedication to my toast, to myself, for the strength to face the truth and the courage to speak it aloud, even when doing so meant confronting painful realities. Some might call it closure, but it felt more like opening, to possibilities, to healing, to a future, unencumbered by the weight of unsettled history. 18 months after the court case, spring arrived, with unusual warmth in Seattle. The memorial garden I'd established had bloomed extravagantly, my mother's favorite daffodils creating swaths of yellow beneath the Japanese maples Grandma Eleanor had always admired. The stone bench now bore a simple plaque, "Margaret and Eleanor. Their strength flows through me." I often sat there in early mornings before work, coffee in hand, thinking about the journey of the past 2 years. The lawsuit that had once consumed my thoughts now felt distant, like a storm viewed from the safety of shore. My father remained in Canada, his name occasionally appearing in local news there for minor infractions, but never attempting further contact with me. The legal system had rendered its judgment, but the more meaningful verdict had been an internal one, the decision to release the anger I'd carried so long without realizing its weight. The Margaret Wilson Memorial Scholarship had just selected its second cohort of recipients. 5 single parents pursuing nursing degrees, each with compelling stories of determination against difficult odds. The foundation board had expanded to include healthcare professionals and education advocates, ensuring the program would outlast any individual stewardship, including mine. We'd established additional support services beyond financial aid, mentorship, childcare assistance, and academic tutoring, creating a comprehensive safety net that addressed the practical challenges I'd witnessed my mother navigate alone. Professional life continued to evolve in satisfying ways. Wilson Consulting had grown to nearly 50 employees with offices in 3 cities. I'd gradually shifted from day-to-day operations towards strategic direction, allowing a talented leadership team to manage most client relationships. This transition created space for a new project that had been percolating since reading my mother's journals, a book about 3 generations of women in my family, examining how trauma and resilience passed between us. Writing didn't come naturally to me. My talents had always leaned toward analytical rather than narrative thinking. But the process proved unexpectedly therapeutic, allowing me to examine family patterns with both compassion and clarity. I interviewed distant relatives, gathered photographs and documents, researched historical contexts that had shaped my grandmother's and mother's choices. The manuscript evolved from strictly memoir toward a broader examination of how economic vulnerability specifically impacts women's health and family stability. My editor, a formidable woman in her 60s who had championed the project from its inception, pushed me to include my father's story as well. Not to excuse, she explained, but to understand. Patterns of abandonment and addiction rarely emerge from nowhere. Reluctantly, I researched his background, discovering generations of financial instability and absent fathers in his family line. His own father had disappeared when he was 9, his grandfather similarly vanishing during the Depression. The context didn't justify his actions but provided a framework for understanding them, less as personal malice and more as a tragic inheritance of his own. This broader perspective allowed the final piece of my healing: genuine indifference toward my father. Not forgiveness exactly, that seemed both impossible and unnecessary, but a release from the emotional tether that had connected us even in his absence. He became a character in my family story rather than a defining force in my life. Derek and I married in a small ceremony in the garden, surrounded only by closest friends and colleagues who had become family. Jasmine served as my maid of honor, her speech bringing equal measures of laughter and tears as she recounted our friendship's evolution from boss employee to chosen sisters. Thomas and Gabriel had insisted on handling all floral arrangements, transforming the already beautiful space into something magical with wildflowers and twinkling lights. "Your mom and grandma would have loved this," Mia whispered as we hugged after the ceremony. "They're here in every detail." She was right. From the classical music Grandma Eleanor had introduced me to playing softly in the background, to the hand-embroidered handkerchief of my mother's I carried, their presence infused the celebration. Not as ghosts or memories to mourn, but as influences woven permanently into the fabric of who I'd become. Life settled into new rhythms. Derek and I balance demanding careers with intentional time together. We discussed children, a possibility I'd never seriously considered before finding this stable ground. The scholarship foundation flourished, expanding to additional schools across Washington state. My book found a modest but appreciative audience, particularly among women navigating similar family complexities. One speaking engagement particularly stood out. A women's leadership conference in Portland invited me to deliver the keynote address about resilience and creating legacy from adversity. Standing at the podium in my hometown, I shared my family's story. Not just the courtroom drama that had briefly made headlines, but the quieter legacy of my mother's sacrifices and my grandmother's wisdom. Afterward, a young woman approached me, her expression a mixture of hesitation and determination. "Your story about your mother's delayed cancer treatment because of financial constraints after your father left," she began. "That happened to my mom too. Except she didn't survive." We found a quiet corner and talked for nearly an hour. Her mother had died when she was 15, leaving her in the care of an aunt. She'd recently discovered similar medical records, showing symptoms reported years before diagnosis. Her father had also disappeared, taking family resources. The parallels were eerie, but unlike me, she still carried crushing anger and guilt. "How did you let it go?" she asked finally. "I feel like I'm drowning in it sometimes." "I didn't let it go," I corrected gently. "I transformed it." The anger became fuel for creating something meaningful. The scholarship, the book, even my business success. The guilt became determination to honor my mother's sacrifices by living fully. We exchanged contact information and I connected her with resources for therapy specializing in complex grief. Over the months that followed, she provided updates on her healing journey, eventually volunteering with the Scholarship Foundation's mentorship program. These connections, the ripple effects of sharing my story authentically, proved to be the most unexpected and rewarding outcome of the entire experience. People reached out regularly after reading the book or hearing me speak, often sharing their own experiences of family fracture and rebuilding. Each conversation reinforced what I had come to believe, that our most painful experiences, when confronted honestly, can become bridges to others walking similar paths. On the second anniversary of the court case, I organized a small gathering at our home, the inner circle who had supported me throughout the ordeal. We sat in the garden as twilight descended, sharing a meal at the large outdoor table Derek had built by hand. "I propose a toast," Thomas announced, raising his glass. "To Jessica, who showed us all what real courage looks like. Not fearlessness, but moving forward despite the fear. And to absent friends," added Jasmine, her eyes meeting mine meaningfully. "To Margaret and Eleanor, whose legacy lives on in ways they probably never imagined. To chosen family," I continued, looking around at these beloved faces, "who prove that family isn't defined by blood but by who stands beside you when it matters most." Later, as guests departed and Derek cleared the last dishes, I remained in the garden, watching stars appear above the lake. The sense of peace I'd gradually cultivated felt solid now. Not the temporary absence of conflict, but a deeper reconciliation with my own story in all its complexity. The journey from that first shocking court summons to this moment of contentment hadn't been linear. There had been setbacks, moments when old anger resurfaced unexpectedly. The difference was that I now had tools to process those emotions without being consumed by them. I had learned that healing isn't about forgetting or even necessarily forgiving, but about integrating difficult experiences into a larger narrative that makes room for joy and purpose alongside acknowledgement of pain. My father's actions had shaped my life in countless ways, creating obstacles but also developing resilience, determination, and independence I might not otherwise have found. My mother's response to those same actions had demonstrated grace under unimaginable pressure. My grandmother's wisdom had provided foundation and perspective when both were desperately needed. Together they had created me, not just genetically but through the complex interplay of presence and absence, support and challenge, love and loss. The courtroom confrontation that had seemed so defining at the time now appeared as just one scene in a much larger story. Important certainly, but neither the beginning nor the end of the narrative. As I prepare to close this chapter of my story with you, I want to leave you with the question that has guided my own healing journey. What truth needs speaking in your life? What burden are you carrying that perhaps doesn't belong to you? Standing firm in your truth, even when difficult, isn't selfish. It's necessary for authentic living and can sometimes help others find their own courage. If my story has resonated with you in any way, I'd love to hear about your experiences in the comments. Have you ever had to stand up to someone who tried to take what was rightfully yours? Whether material possessions, your self-worth, or your truth, what gave you the strength to do so? Please consider subscribing if you found value in this story, and sharing it with someone who might need to hear that standing in their truth is worth the temporary discomfort. Remember that the most valuable inheritance isn't money or property. It's the strength to protect what matters most, your dignity, your boundaries, and your right to define your own worth. Thank you for witnessing my journey. May you find the courage to speak your own truths when necessary, and the wisdom to build something beautiful from whatever challenges you face.